Set 3 showdowns and planetary qualifiers are officially underway, and at least locally, we now have our first one in the books. With everybody looking for that tech to try and give them the edge, we definitely had a wide variety of decks perform very well at our local event. And I wanted to spend some time talking about it, so let's get right into it. Welcome back, everyone. It's been a little bit since I did some Star Wars content. I haven't been slacking, at least as Star Wars goes, but I just haven't put stuff out on YouTube. There's a few reasons for that, but we'll talk about that another time. Today, we're going to talk about the event that happened at Alternate Universes, this time at their Holmes location, and we'll talk about what performed well in the early stages of this Showdown meta. Now, I know there have been a number of larger scale events, whether we're talking about across the pond, over in the UK, or throughout the US this past weekend as well. So you have a lot of data to comb through. This is just going to be a small snippet of the greater and larger picture that is, well, the current Star Wars environment. As always, I want to give a quick shout out to Alternate Universes. Thank you for hosting. It is one of a few different stores that are, I consider, my locals. I try to hit all of these each week if possible, but this is a great preparation for the upcoming PQs that are going to be in our general area. And we may have some more to say about that at a later time. Editing me here real quick. I forgot to say that all of the deck lists were pictures, like physical pictures of the cards laid out on the table. So I had to transcribe them into SWDB, with the exception of a few people that had sent me images. That means that, just forgive me if I messed up a card here or there because I'm looking at a picture and glare and all that kind of stuff. Pilots, if I mess something up, please let me know in the comments. Also, I did say this later, but links for all the decks will, of course, be in the description. Now, as always, I am going to work from the top 8 down to or up to the actual winner. In this case, we're going to start off with Sabine. This is, of course, an oldie but a goodie. Now, in speaking with Everett, who piloted this list, it's funny, Star Wars is not actually their main game, and he had indicated that they were just trying out this deck that their friend loaned him, one of our other locals, and obviously it served them very well. Sabine does Sabine things, and you can absolutely bury someone who is unprepared. Now, a few different points of note here. Yes, the sideboard's only 9 cards. Yes, that is actually what it was. It's fine. It's not the end of the world. They were able to end up top 8ing anyway, quite clearly. Now, the main deck is where we're going to see some additional spice, because the sideboard itself definitely makes sense. I mean, the Daring Raids helps out against Jango, disabling Fang Fighters to help push against Bossk. Bright Hope, also an anti-Jango tool. It's completely reasonable to see these main deck, but in this particular case, wasn't necessary. Shifting gears to the main deck, we do have a unique plethora of, well, like I said, spice. Starting off with the pumps, only 5 here, notably a Singleton Heroic Sacrifice, 2 Rebel Assault, 2 Metal Ceremony. Recently, a lot of players have been getting away from Metal Ceremony, partially due to Jango, partially due to other factors. I personally would love to see the 3rd Rebel Assault, and I'd be curious about Everett's thoughts after the event. Going in, I know, as mentioned, that this was not their deck. They had borrowed it off of someone, but what is their input after, at the end of the day? Did it serve you well? Would you rather have had extra? Would you rather it have been something else? The Heroic Sacrifice typically is an anti-control tool. The meta for this particular event was incredibly varied. In fact, while I don't have specific numbers, I would not be surprised to learn that there was, among the 20 players, maybe 2 duplicate decks. That may not even be true. We had a wide variety of different things with everybody trying whatever their idea happened to be for this particular week. Now, moving from there, this is still featuring Timely Intervention. This goes in and out of Sabine lists fairly frequently. The additional R2, I've never really been a big supporter of R2 in Sabine lists. I certainly have played it. My wife has certainly has played it. I'm not in love with it. It gives you an extra copy of something, another turn 1 play for you to do stuff, or just squeeze something in so you can go a little bit wider in the matchups where you care about that. Additionally, as we move up the cost curve, we're seeing some regular staples, but notably there's Jyn Erso, which I did actually play against Everett, both in the Swiss as well as in the top 8. And I know spoilers. And I do distinctly recall them stating, hey, why aren't people playing this card more? And I kind of agree. I do like Jyn Erso, but there is the element of a lot of people trying to include hate for Jango, which for red decks at least takes the form of, say, Daring Raid, and Jyn Erso kind of catches some of that collateral damage. It is what it is, but it is another 3-power turn 1 play. Even if it's non-standard, it's reasonable to me. Continuing up the cost curve, no one's going to be surprised by most of the things that are here until you hit Yularen. This has popped up here and there in a variety of different Sabine lists, and I think it actually is kind of a big deal. The big deal here is that Yularen causes issues for breakpoints. So for example, you have Yularen out and then you smuggle a Cassian Andor. That can no longer be hit by takedown without additional steps, meaning the Cassian's already going to punch for 3. Does that matter in the long run? Possibly, especially if you're maybe in the aggro mirror and you trade into, or air quotes trade, it's not no longer a trade, to eat something, you maintain board position while continuing to apply pressure on future turns. Additionally, the Restore 1 can definitely differentiate you in these aggro mirrors or in other scenarios where you just want a little bit of extra breathing. One other piece that is very interesting is the 2 of Darksaber. Now, I don't know if this was intentional, if this was a collection restraint, or what the case is. Just about everybody almost immolated their Darksabers once Jango started to come into prominence. However, the reality is that at this point in the meta, Darksaber seems to have certainly come back into full swing and is presenting itself as a respectable threat once again. Why is that, even though Jango is showing up? Because at the end of the day, there's only so many taps. Make them have it, or just row it. If you really feel that Darksaber is 100% dead in the scenario when you draw it, row it. But you want it main deck because there's so many things that just go, well, I guess I lose because you deployed Sabine and gave her a Darksaber. That oops, I win factor is very important, especially over the course of a long tournament. Speaking of Jango, let's get this one out of the way. Well, maybe not out of the way. This was piloted by Alfonso, who, I guess, a small anecdote real quick. Alfonso, I think, was the first person outside of my family that we played Star Wars with. I mean, we got taught the game at Gen Con way back 2 years ago, whatever. But the first store that I went to, my wife and I went, and we sat down and we started playing with this person, and it turned out to be Alfonso. And now Alfonso has come back and is performing very well, so shout out to him. This is a very interesting build. It is sporting some tech that I'm starting to see pop up in other places, and I can respect it. We'll talk about it as we get through the list. Looking at the main deck, there's certainly a lot of things that, yeah, these are what Jango decks run. You got the ISB agents, you of course have Daring Raids. Cartel Spacer has definitely become a 3 of over time, although sometimes you'll see it as a 2 here and there. No Good to Me Deads, Crafties, and now Sneak Attack have become staples. I'm personally not a fan of Sneak Attack. It definitely seems to be a love it or hate it kind of thing. Maybe that's too extreme. I don't hate it, but I've never really been impressed. It's just like, this is fine. And maybe I need to just personally be forcing it more often. So I'd love to hear any Jango pilots out there. Do you love Sneak Attack? Do you hate it? Because I understand it cognitively, but I just don't feel it, I guess is how I'd put it. I don't know. I just can't fall in love with this thing. So the first piece of spice that we're going to be looking at here is actually only 2 Kylo silencers in the main. This is an oddity to me, and I hesitate to call things wrong, but having a 3-2 for 2 in space seems like you pretty much always want to start that way, unless you happen to have, ISB Greedos. Spoiler alert, those are not in the main. We'll touch on that as well. We're moving on from Kylo, which, okay, there's 2 there. Maybe it's because the slots went somewhere else. One of the other places that this is a new-ish turn 1 play for this deck is Bazine. This has definitely made its appearances in sideboards. Calling back to the Greedo opener, which you'll see are in the sideboard, and again, we'll touch on that later. The big thing here is that Greedo is actually an active liability in a variety of matchups. So you can talk about all the pangs, whether it's from opposing Jangos, it's from Quinlan's, or whatever the effect may be. Additionally, against Bossk, specifically Bossk Blue, Greedo is an additional liability early in the game. You really don't want to play Greedo on turn 1, because guess what? That's going to get hit with a top target, and it's going to end up healing the Bossk player for 12, because they're just going to set it up, and it's going to be trivial to do so. So what ends up happening is you end up rowing Greedo early on. Maybe you'll play it later in the game if you play it at all. So enter Bazine. Also notably a unique, but at least provides some disruption. And realistically, Bazine is a respectable turn 1 play against a variety of things. At this point in time, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the idea of, hey, I'll ISB your guy, Tarkintown, and then later on in the game, I'm going to run the ISB in and tap it down with Jango. Very similar thing with Bazine. You just send her into something, and guess what? That thing's turned off for a turn. Additionally, it strips something away, and in certain matchups, notably the Bossk matchup, you kind of need to see Bazine in order to ensure that threat answers, the combo there of stuff like Snoke, don't hit the board, because that essentially ends the game on the spot for you. This is before you even consider that your opponent mulliganed, and if they aren't paying attention or their deck just doesn't cooperate, if you're on the play, you have initiative, you Bazine and take their turn 1 play, and you're like light years ahead, because their entire setup is now disrupted. Bazine can do a lot of things, and of course it also could be smuggled, so I like the inclusion of the Bazines. Should it be in place of Greedo? I can respect it. I think it's completely reasonable. I just don't know that I want to cut a Kylo's tie also, but we'll see as we look at the rest of the list. Now, breaking in is something that has shown up in lists, was definitely there initially, and has kind of fallen out of favor. Surprise strikes no one's surprised by, but the combination of having 5 pumps is kind of a big deal, and that's really the way I think you should look at them. It's a package deal, and whether you want 5 or 4 or 3. They're not quite extra surprise strikes. Of course, they're a little bit different. For most intents and purposes, they're the same. Notably, you could also pop shields and eliminate the client. Speaking of the Bossk matchup, I've seen a lot of lists cut breaking in, and I have personally, but I absolutely respect having them main. It is completely reasonable, and I can't fall. If I'm looking at this list with breaking in, it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Now, going from there, we have a string of things that, yeah, you're going to play 7 Fleet, you're going to play Lurking Ties, Triple Dark, Let's Go Gambling, duh. And then, of course, the Elite P38. Moving from there, we do have something that has been showing up with more regularity because of the KTOD guys, and that is Geonosis Patrol Fighter. It's something that's been on my list for Jango for a while, because I played a lot of it in Palp 2 when I was testing that early on in the meta. This thing is insane. We've seen at this stage all of the exploit synergy, whether it's P38 or it's Ruthless Raider or it's just cheating something into play. Heavy Persuader did it first and paved the way for Geonosis Patrol Fighter, except now this is also space, it's also a vehicle, and it also impacts the board immediately. Not only could you get pings and tap downs, you're also getting a pseudo waylay, or in this case, I guess, clear the field. Being a 3-2 as well, yeah, it'll still die to those daring raids. Odds are they already burned them on things. The point is that this body is still a respectable threat. It is a threat that maintains tempo, and it just feels like it's a perfect addition to the Jango list. So I love seeing it here. Moving on, we got another string of 7 cards that you're absolutely expecting, but the last 4 are ones that stand out a little bit. 7 is a big number in Star Wars Unlimited when we're talking about base damage or really anything. So tagging your opponent, like just punching them right in the neck with a Cad Bane, it is probably going to end the game on the spot. Additionally, it's great for the mirror and a number of other scenarios where you take their Ruthless Raiders and they don't get the when defeated. Now, moving from there, the last 2 slots have typically been a sideboard slot. I've been leaning into it main, personally. But Emperor Palpatine is something that I played in a variety of other decks, and that's why I was interested in playing it here in Jango. Why are you playing Palpatine? It's an 8 cost in a deck that is ostensibly an aggro deck. Palpatine really here is a tool to fight Snoke, which is ironic. Spoilers. The majority of your threats just die while Snoke is on the board. I'll Cad Bane it, it's off the board, and your Bossk opponent goes, fell the dragon, and you go, I'll scoop him up and move on to game 2. Palpatine, on the other hand, whether you sneak attack it out or not, ends up actually removing the Snoke forever. That thing is gone. I guess I get Palpatine's return. Again, irony. But because it is gone, not in hand, not captured, it makes their life a little more difficult because they have to draw a second copy. Maybe they have it, maybe they don't. Plus, Palpatine, of course, is its own threat. And in this particular list, because you can sneak attack it out, it isn't impossible in certain matchups where Palpatine's either going to clear the way or allow you to win the race because, hey, I'm quote-unquote playing 4 Cad Banes. These are one-sided wrath effects in an aggressive list. I really like Palpatine. I tend to prefer it myself. But again, I think that there are a number of slots in Jango that allow you to just customize it to your own preferences, and they are all respectable. They may drive different play patterns from you, whether it's for different matchups or just on the whole, but they are all respectable choices and completely reasonable. So let's take a look at the sideboard. We already talked about Greedo, but just to reinforce it, you don't love it in a variety of matchups. I imagine this came in a lot against anything that wasn't pinging because it is still a threat. You still have then the potential, once it's actually in the main deck and you've shuffled it up and presented your opponent to cut, that you could go Greedo into ISB Agent or ISB into Greedo on turn 1, blow up their board, and you're way ahead. I did that a lot as Space Jango, and it feels good. It feels real good. Wolf has now, people have finally recognized that this is better than the new ship. Why is it better than the new ship? Because it actually turns off healing. If you're playing against an opponent that is blue, they're just going to play Vigilance, choose the defeat mode first, then the heal to blow up the ship and heal 5. Wolf turns it off for the entire turn and ensures that they're not actually recovering, or recovering certainly less than they would with Confederate Tri-Fighter. The extra no good to me dead, there's a lot of applications where that would come in. Any other aggressive opponent, any deck that tries to lean on its leader, shout out to Han, that sort of thing. No good to me dead will come in and actually allow you to impact their board. The extra Kylo, I'm not really sure where this was coming in. Again, I don't know why it wasn't main. It's clearly a numbers thing, but I feel like I cut a Cad Bane or a Palpatine in order to get the Kylo in the main, personally. Disabling Fang Fighter, more Bossk stuff, and of course Imperial Interceptor is presumably for the mirror. Jango is absolutely one of the best decks in the meta right now. I love this deck. I might play it for PQs. I'm not sure. I have, at the time of this recording, about a week and a half left to decide. Probably, well, technically less than that, but I'll give myself a week and a half because I have been known to choose a deck the night before. But either way, shout out to Alfonso, well done. Now, our astute viewer may not be impressed with the decks that we have presented thus far. Okay, Sabine, fine. Jango, all right. However, there is, I guarantee nobody out there is like, oh yeah, the Mandalorian is 100% going to top 8 these events. Because guess what? The Mandalorian did in fact top 8 this event. This was piloted by Ty. Ty is not a player that I had the opportunity to play against. I don't know them that well. I don't know if they attend the other AU events or not. I don't believe we've played before. I could be wrong. But regardless, let's take a look at this Mando list. This is an interesting list. It's definitely sporting a bunch of upgrades as you'd expect. But what's kind of cute with this is now it's not just positive upgrades, if that makes sense. You're clearly only putting upgrades in if they are positive. Now you have Perilous Position, which means that you could Perilous their big guy, which was somewhat of a gap in the Mandalorian plan, where if they get too large, you can't actually tap it. But you can Perilous their guy, tap down a second guy, and then on top of it, that guy, the bigger guy that you shrunk, is probably now in range for the Mandalorian going forward, which is actually really cool. I didn't get to see this deck in action, but it seems awesome. And it definitely seems like something that I want to try and sleeve up. I don't think there's enough time between now and my PQ to figure it out, but there's definitely some cool ideas, and I definitely overheard, I said definitely a lot in those last few seconds, but I absolutely overheard Electro Staff confusing people and messing up math, either because I was sitting next to the table or nearby. Other than the upgrades, which by the way, because of Perilous Position and of course the other upgrades, the Razor Crest, the natural inclusion in the Mandalorian, is also way better because now you have a ton of things that you want to bring back, and Perilous Position is compared to, hey, I bring back a lightsaber, allows you, and we've seen this in other decks, to interact with your opponent's board and serve multiple roles. So you can remove something early, get it back with Razor Crest, and then deal with something again, all stacking the Mando upgrades. Now, there are a couple things here that did draw my attention beyond that, as in, I'm not sure how they played out. The math on Queel, I didn't do the math prior to this recording. We could probably figure it out, but I don't know if there's enough blue for this. It seems close enough. I'd have to compare it to, say, the Anakin blue list to see, hey, are we at the appropriate threshold? Or I could just crunch the numbers. But beyond that, we also are featuring Chewbacca. While Obi-Wan has definitely shown up in a variety of lists, Chewbacca has not. And I don't know if this was a meta call, if this player was expecting or has played against like a ton of Sabine and therefore wanted the extra chunky body on the ground to play Sentinel. But regardless, if you stick like Electro Staff or Jedi Lightsaber or something on Chewbacca, what exactly are they going to do outside of Fell the Dragon? A Jedi lightsaber on Chewbacca means it's a 6/9 that gets to ready and swing every time they attack. Like that's actually bonkers when you think about it and spend like that thing is huge. I'm not sure exactly what the game plan is into that if you're not playing yellow for bounce or you're not playing blue for fell. You're kind of in a rough spot, to be honest. Now, the Air Force here is also in a pretty decent spot. We talked about Razor Crest, but Falcon plus Concord Dawn interceptors means that you have 8 ships, and Concord Dawn is one of the better ships to annoy Jango. It's not the end of the world as the Jango player, but it is frustrating because having to trade in your Lurking Tie that you thought was just going to kind of win you the game into a blue deck is absolutely annoying. Of course, you could run P38 in to remove it cleanly, air quotes, via the trade. This deck naturally has a bunch of ways to mess with that math, whether you're playing any upgrade and using the Mandalorian effect to tap something down, or you're actually using Perilous Position or quote unquote real removal to actually get the thing off the board. There's a lot of cool stuff going on in this deck, and I really regret not seeing this in action. Moving to the sideboard, we got Sparks, we got Waylays, Fell the Dragon, and Kira. This, to me, most of it, at least 6 of the cards, seem to be anti-control. I have to imagine this deck is going to struggle extremely hard into something like Bossk. Probably something like Kira as well. You can definitely put the hurt on your opponent. There are no surprise strikes, main or board, and there's the potential that you get blown out because, oh, I hit an Ezra, I hit a lightsaber, and then they fell or whatever, and they remove it. They Kira flip and just clear your board, that sort of thing. There's definitely plays like that that could be problematic. But look, it's a Mandalorian deck, and this actually feels like it's kind of close. If it's not there, it definitely feels close. It's certainly one of the better Mandalorian lists that I've seen. So, shout out to Ty. Speaking of lists that you probably didn't expect coming in, this is Obi-Wan ECL. Jay was piloting this, and Jay had piloted a Ray Yellow list to a top 4 finish at this same store in set 2 Showdown. So shout out to them for that. I did make a video about that. You can check that out in the archive. But we actually got to talking both before, during, and after the event about this particular list, and I know there's some changes that they're intending to make. We'll see where they take it from here. One other thing I want to call out before we dive into the list, apparently Transient Arts is Jay's TikTok account. I'm not a big TikTok person, but I wanted to call that out because they're making content on that platform. So if you're a TikTok person, check them out. Looking at the actual list, top to bottom, you know what? We'll be unique. We'll go bottom up. We'll start with the top end here. Home ones and U-Wings are going to surprise no one. In the discussions that I had during the event with this player, the persistent refrain that I had was, I have no idea how blue-green hero beats heavy control like Bossk or a true Kira deck or something like that. And my guess was always, hey, you string U-Wings. Like you go Luke, they SLB or something, you follow up with a U-Wing, they try and answer that, then you follow up again with Home 1 or another U-Wing or whatever, and that's how you end up just overwhelming them past a certain point. Ideally, you would have pressured them earlier in the game. That isn't necessarily going to be a thing that could happen, but that's at least the idea. I think Blue-Green Hero might be positioned pretty well, and we'll touch on this as we elaborate on some of the notable exclusions, that are not present in this list. But Home 1 and U-Wing absolutely makes sense. The 2 of Luke, I don't remember if it was stated that this was a collection constraint, but I think you absolutely want the full set of Lukes every time you're playing Blue-Green Hero, or Blue Hero at all. Your list always starts out with 3 Luke Skywalker. It's like, why not? Now, one thing that I was not a fan of, but I will say there was an absolutely insane board state that I did walk past and see at one point. I believe it was actually in the top 8 match, or one of the top 8 matches, and that's featuring Clone Commander Cody. I'm not a huge fan of this guy. He's just kind of small, but there was a point where between Cody and a variety of other onboard buffs, such as Yularen, made Echo just enormous, as well as the rest of the board, of course. And it makes things, we called out Yularen earlier in the Sabine list, and we'll talk about it again. These health buffs, or these stat buffs, end up screwing with your opponent's math. Because if they had intended, oh, well, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to take down that other thing, and suddenly it's out of takedown range. Or I was going to trade, I'm attacking here, then I'm going to trade in, now you can no longer trade. And it just makes your opponent's life that much more difficult. And given the way this deck played out, and from the board states that I observed, getting the coordinate live really wasn't that difficult, seemingly. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Clone Commander Cody is actually gas and I've just been sleeping on it, but I'm not a huge fan. It clearly worked out for them. Ayla, however, I've definitely seen do very well. We've seen Quinlan lists use it. We've seen a variety of other lists use it. Again, the coordinate isn't too difficult to enable because you only need to do it that once. And then you're getting the value, and then you're building the snowball or continuing the snowball, because now you have a 6-5 on the board that they have to immediately deal with, or the game is kind of over. They're going to eat your entire board. We've all seen a Delphi Patrol Wing in the past has shown up in a variety of Sabine lists, as opposed to any other Han unit. We've all seen how well Han unit works. Ayla does it for cheaper, as long as you have ECL. It's a build a Han. Imagine you have initiative and you're able to Adelphi Patrol Wing Luke in for 8, or Ayla in for 8. You can close a game in short order or put it out of reach due to the way the race will work very easily. Or, of course, if you have initiative, you can allow your team to remove something. There's a lot of cool things that you can do. Moving further down the curve, Shock T, I'm not personally a fan of, but it is something that reinforces a few different themes within the deck. First of all, it is a Jedi and it's Force, so of course, General's Blade synergy. Secondly, it creates tokens, enabling the aforementioned coordinate guys. Third, because it creates tokens, it's generating this board state where after the first one, you now have like, okay, I got kind of what I paid for here, and you can start pushing from there. The challenge is always going to be, how do I get that first attack? Energy Conversion Lab is the obvious answer, but if you use that on Shock T, then that means it's not available for Ayla or other units. It's a tough call to make, but there are ways to make it happen. General's Blade is, I don't want to say the card's slept on, but General's Blade feels like one of those things that everybody was excited about and then not many people are talking about. There is some incredibly explosive plays that you can make with this card and lock a game up, whether it goes on the leader, because, hey, we saw Darksaber on Sabine. Leaders with upgrades are pretty damn threatening. Or there's a bunch of Jedi floating around, whether it's Huyang, it's Shock T, it's Ayla, it's Luke. Like, there's a bunch of things you could give the sword to. Or just give it to a Gamorrean retainer, and this guy's a 6-5. Sometimes that's all you got to do. I like the General's Blade. It can definitely let you cheat some things. We've seen the power of it in Quinlan Green. It makes sense here. The Republic Arc is just a 3-4 ship. You can ambush in, and this has been my big complaint with Bossk Green, is that you can ambush in and contest Jango's ships, but A, 4 health, so it might just die to a P-38. B, if you ambush in, it's just going to get Tarkintown, and that doesn't necessarily get you ahead on board. If you have initiative, you might be okay. If they have initiative, it's not thrilling. So I personally would rather see Bright Hopes in here, but curve considerations, and obviously this worked out for this player, so it's tough to argue with the success, right? Hu Yang is another card that I said it earlier, offline, but I kind of hate Hu Yang, but there are undeniably openers where Hu Yang just goes bananas. If you go Retainer into Hu Yang, that's a 5/4 Sentinel. Additionally, he is a Jedi, as mentioned before, so General's Blade pairs well with him. He has value here. I don't know. There's something about Hu Yang that I just don't like. I can't quite articulate it, but it's more of a general dislike as compared to particularly in this list. After that, a lot of these things make sense except for the numbers. I would personally want to see a full set of Concord Dawn as well as Perilous Position. However, I think that Jango may just not be a concern for these kind of decks. It may be in this current configuration, but the combination of Concord Dawn and Bright Hope, if it were to make an appearance, in conjunction with the Restore, admittedly there's no Yoda here, there's no Kanan, that sort of thing, it makes it really difficult for Jango. It makes life challenging. You can still do it as the Jango player, but you're going to have to work pretty hard. Echo-based Defender is fine. It's another Hu Yang target. The problem I have with Echo-based Defender is it dies to most 1-drops, and that's from virtually every deck. It could be Greedo. It could be Battlefield Marine. It could be Sabine. It could be an enormous list of things. So your 2-drop dies to their turn 1 play, and you just feel behind. But with U-Wing, it means that there is a Sentinel to fetch, so it kind of feels like a requirement, in my opinion. You could always go Echo Base plus Concord Dawn plus 1-drop, which we'll touch on shortly. Echo, this guy ended up getting enormous throughout the day. I just kept hearing, oh yeah, my Echo is insert huge number. Aside from the coordinate, of course, you have Cody, you have Yularen. There are ways to buff him up, and he can become a big threat. We already talked about the retainers, but at worst, they are able to trade with opposing Battlefield Marines. Spark of Hope is another card that I personally can't stand, and I would run resupply over it. But in speaking with Jay, they were kind of swearing by this card and really seemed to like it and were very high on it and very low on resupply. So maybe I'll have to give it another shot because the Spark of Hope seemed to put in a lot of work for them. Of course, Obi-Wan deploys a little bit later. There are higher end cards in this deck. The ramp certainly does help, and it's not unlikely that some of your early game units are going to bite the dust on a turn that you can actually play Spark and possibly play something else. The Queel numbers, we'd have to go through. There definitely seems to be more green in this than blue, which if considerations for certain cards change, you increase the amount of Luke, you increase the amount of Perilous Position, you increase the amount of Concord Dawn. You're cutting some green for that. It may change the Queel numbers, but Queel is probably good enough in this shell to be playing anyway. The 2 timelies give you your extra energy conversion labs. And lastly, Clone Deserter was something that the pilot stated multiple times they hated running. And in fact, in discussing it with them, they're going to try and swap in Alliance Dispatcher to see how that plays out. The Dispatcher does pretty well in Luke decks. I've tried it in other things as well. It seems all right. It may be a challenge here just because Obi-Wan doesn't necessarily have a way to protect it. And given the pseudo Sentinel, it creates a weird issue for you as the Obi-Wan player where, well, if I need it, I don't want it to die. It's all well and good to say, oh, well, my opponent has to attack it. We don't want them to attack it because you want it to do the thing that it's there to do. So it's going to be interesting to see how this list evolves. Now, the sideboard featuring Confiscate, Tech, the aforementioned resupplies, Fell the Dragon, Obi-Wan's Aether Sprite, all of these are fairly obvious. You're bringing them in like techs and resupplies against control decks. Of course, Fel against anything big, whether it's control or otherwise. Either sprites against Jango. And the Singleton Confiscate to try and fight those Darksabers. Or, well, I guess maybe the Mandalorian. I don't know. Maybe there's something here to Obi-Wan. We were discussing it, as mentioned, for a while. I like the idea of Rey Green or Luke or something like that a little bit more. I think that there are other options that are presented by those leaders that shift the matchup spread rather than Obi-Wan. However, I did say it. It's difficult to argue its success, and this got a top 8 berth, so congratulations. With our top 8 out of the way, let's talk about top 4, and we're going to an oldie but a goodie. Maybe not. I don't know if it qualifies as oldie, but Dan here was running Hantu Blue, a deck that has all but disappeared. I think a lot of it was the rise of Anakin and Anakin builds. Kind of just, hey, it's the same colors, or why would I ever play that deck when I could do this? And there was a level of this is the new hotness. But as I said multiple times throughout the day at the event, even if you assume that Han2 is worse than Anakin, the Han2 deck is still running a lot of good cards. It's not a pile of bad cards that was barely scraping by. It was a respectable deck before, and most of this list should not surprise you with a few exceptions. It has been a bit since I looked at Han2, but R2 I don't think was in Dan's list before either, going back to set 2. Maybe I just never saw it. The R2s are kind of notable. I think the Singleton techs and most of the rest of the list is looking fairly standard. You of course have Kiadi that comes in from set 3. The Kiadi post split is kind of probably just personal preference. I think most of the time, you'd rather have Poe, but that is me leaning into more aggressive pushes rather than, hey, I'll draw cards and then get there eventually. It may just be a matchup spread thing as well. We don't see an additional copy of either in the board, so it's up for debate there. One of the other spicy techs is the Mace Windu. Now, you'll notice there's only 2 pillages, which I personally would want to see 3 of. But I guess you could shave one. Maybe that's where the room for Mace came in. But ultimately, Mace Windu is a big threat. Gives you an excuse if you played in some showdowns in set 1 to try and use those. You can definitely mop up a board as well as push a bunch of damage with this. If you cheat him out, it's even more dangerous. I like Mace in this list. I think it looks really cool. Now, looking at the sideboard, we have Make an Opening, which, full disclosure, I had to do this. They didn't collect deck lists. They took pictures of the decks. We laid out all the cards and took pictures. And this was kind of cut off. So I'm looking at a very tiny sliver of the art to try and discern what it is, because you couldn't see the text box or the name or the cost or anything. So I'm assuming this is a Make an Opening. Given there were only 2 perilous positions, I vaguely recall Dan saying something about having Make an Opening over perilous for the heal, but I could be wrong. Concord Dawn coming in, disabling Fangfighter, tech, Obi-Wan's Aether Sprite, and Forced Surrender. All but 3 cards in this board, well, maybe not all but 3, but there's a bunch of stuff in this board to help fight space decks, a la Jango. Tech to help give you a edge, or some tech, for the grindier matchups. Forced Surrender is actually pretty interesting. It's not something that you typically see any longer. It's definitely shown up here and there in the past, but you can really brutally beat somebody with that. All you got to do is a little bit of damage. It could even be them removing your K2, shoot them for 3, they discard 2, you draw 2. That's pretty mean. That's pretty mean. So we'll see if this catches on, but Hantu Blue, like I said, is something that had fallen by the wayside. Maybe this is the sleeper pick. Maybe this is the deck that people have forgotten about and shouldn't have. So congratulations to Dan. Shifting from the old guard to the new, Pat was piloting Rebel Yoda. We were joking about the pictures that the store was taking of the deck list, and Pat said, turns out Pat did have a SWODB link. Links for all of this, of course, will be in the description if you want to see the deck list yourselves. There's a lot of things going on in this list that, all right, let's just get into it. So I played a bunch of Yoda. I started with red, then I went to mono blue. I tested out a little bit of green, but not nearly as much as Pat obviously did. And I mean, look at this list. The C-3POs were unreal on the day. So, of course, you had the Yoda activations to set up the C-3PO, so you're essentially just drawing a card. C-3PO put in a lot of work. Again, we have Echo-based Defender, but as mentioned previously, U-Wing kind of justifies that. It's also notably a rebel. And this was something that Pat had mentioned in one of our games, that while he was building the deck, there was kind of this dawning discovery of, hey, a lot of these are rebels. What if we lean into that? And, well, Battlefield Marine, C-3PO, Echo-based Defender, Fleet Lieutenant, Wing Leader, General Dodonna. Like, there's bright hope. There's more. Just keep going. There's a lot of rebels in this list, and it allowed for this Yoda deck to actually put together a fairly impressive offense, because sometimes, hey, this thing is just big enough that I can beat you to death with it, and there's not much you can do to stop it. And if you do, all right, now because it took you so long to deal with it, I potentially have been restoring, building up my board. Now I, Luke Skywalker, remove whatever it was that you put in so much effort to try and kill my guy, and you have to deal with Luke and Home 1 and U-Wing and Reinforcement Walker. There's a lot of things in here that present a crazy, crazy threat. And I like this idea. It's definitely a different take on the Yoda list. I will say, especially in our game and just in general commentary, Pat had mentioned the absence of takedown, which is something that is present typically in a lot of Yoda lists. And that's, you got to make concessions to fit in this other spice. And in this particular case, the lack of the takedowns did end up hurting him in the long run. Whether it is appropriate or not is another story. Maybe it is correct to axe the takedowns, whether it's for this Rebel version or another. Sometimes you just have to accept that this card that you thought was always going to be in the deck list doesn't truly belong. And Takedown is one of those cards. Given Yoda's rather expensive deploy, we do have resupplies, no Spark of Hope, main or board here. So really relying on those particular resupplies. You do have the Star Wars Unlimited version of Seething Song in You're My Only Hope. And we had some crazy You're My Only Hopes happen over the course of the day. I've done some in testing, and yeah, it's real. Like, you can really make something happen. It sounds like a long shot, but think about how many games you've had something die. It's like every game, right? So now all you have to do is have You're My Only Hope, and you're filtering the entire time with Yoda. You'll give up initiative a lot, but it's a blue-green hero. You're going to have ways to restore. Notably, speaking of restore and healing, only 2 Vigilance and 2 Kanan before you get to Luke's. Yes, there's Restore on Home 1 and a little bit on Restored Arc, but we're not seeing Yodas or an overwhelming amount of Restore, so you do have to be a little bit cautious of your life total. I think the thing, though, that I've been kind of beating around the bush and just didn't draw everyone to, that everyone's screaming at their monitor, is Wedge Antilles. Did this work out on the day? It got played against me. It did not stay in play very long against me because I didn't know what else to expect. But the idea of Wedge actually being in a list is actually really cool. We're not that far away from set 4 where pilots and vehicles are going to get much more attention, but we've seen Reinforcement Walkers with Admiral Piet do some crazy things. Wedge is significantly more expensive. However, Wedge is cooler. So I will say, shout out to Pat for sticking the Wedge in here. It's actually pretty awesome. Moving to the board, we have double restock, confiscate, full set of Concord Dawn, 2 extra techs, the other Vigilance, and a Fell the Dragon. Nothing here is that surprising except for maybe the restocks. I'm not a huge fan of the idea, and I'm making some assumptions here, that you're going to go grindy against Bossk, let's say. I guess it's possible. This is the same line of argumentation when we were discussing the Obi-Wan list, that can you actually get there? Is back to back U-Wings the way, or is it U-Wing Home 1, other big body, just keep taxing their super laser blast so they have to do what you want them to do? Your hand is multiple U-Wings. You're okay if they take an entire turn to super laser blast because you're just going to repair your board immediately. But I don't know that you're fighting the mill game at that point. I don't know. Maybe that's necessary because you end up filtering out so many cards from your deck as a result of U-Wings and other effects. You know, if you board in the techs and you're smuggling a lot and you're doing the U-Wings and you get multiple bodies, your deck will run out. Maybe that's why. But other than the takedowns, this seemed to perform very well on the day. So if you're looking for a base for Rebel Yoda, or just Yoda in general, Yoda Green or other versions, this is definitely one worth taking a look at and dissecting. So congratulations. Once more with the anecdote. I was originally intending to restream the North Dakota PQ. I had reached out to members on the Jodo cast, and I'd said, hey, you know, I'm interested in restreaming the event. Is that cool? They said yes. And then I found out that there were these showdowns locally because I had kind of forgotten about them. So all week I was debating back and forth, and people were asking me as I was going to locals, like, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm planning on restreaming. I got the okay, so I'm probably going to do that. And then the morning of, I did like a pre-stream to check all the settings. And Anthony comes in and checks in on the stream. He's like, hey, are you going today? And I said, no, I think I'm going to restream the event instead. And he goes, okay, sweet. That way I won't fall to you in the finals. Like the last two events. Spoiler alert, I didn't restream the event. I did, in fact, go, and there's one person left that we haven't talked about. So we'll let you put two and two together. So shout out to Anthony. Running Bossk Blue back, has been running it for a while. I really do need to test with Anthony more because I respect his ability to play Bossk very well. You can make arguments that Bossk is a very linear deck, and while that may be true, the reality is that appropriately and properly playing a control deck is very challenging, especially over the course of many rounds and many hours. And that was definitely apparent in our finals game because it was like a 10-hour day at that point. And we were joking about it afterwards after I got home. I said, yeah, I can't wait for 2 weeks at the PQ when we have another 3 or 4 hours after this, hopefully. Knock on wood. Cross fingers, whatever your superstition of choice is. But regardless, the main deck for this is fairly standard. We have been debating at locals on multiple occasions about specific numbers for things. I'm going to call attention to the Bounty Hunters crew specifically. The theory at this point in time for me is you need to main deck all of your control mirror tech main deck because you will not finish the other games. And Anthony did end up getting a double loss on the day in the Swiss rounds due to similar things. I've heard tons of control players across many games say, oh, it's always the other player because I play my deck very fast and they slow it down. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Because if they're playing at a reasonable pace, even if it is on the slower side of things, it is not unreasonable for your game one to take 35, 40 minutes. Then you take another 2-3 minutes for shuffling, another 2-3 minutes potentially for sideboarding. You're just not finishing 3 games. Probably not finishing 2 games. So the point is, main deck your anti-control tech because one game is likely all you are going to get. Especially because, and don't get me wrong, am I an expert in the control mirror? No. I played a bunch of them, but I'm not going to play them in a big event because of the way the timing rules work for Star Wars. And I'd like to actually be able to pee in between rounds. You know, human things. So the Singleton Bounty Hunter crew, I think, is a good call. At the end of the day, it just comes back to the fact that you're only going to play one game. The ideal play pattern, I think, for control mirrors is you wait until the last possible moment, like anything else, in order to play your restocks, your vigilance, your whatever. And if you're doing that, you don't know necessarily, like maybe you hit them with an early vigilance, but you're probably going to sit on one because when they go to start their restock loop, you want to have the vigilance ready to immediately play and then kill their vigilance and end the game on the spot. If both players are doing this dance and they don't have Bazine's main or other ways to disrupt the restocks, the vigilances, whatever, and you don't get lucky with an early vigilance where it's like, hey, I mill you with vigilance and I hit restock 2 vigilance, your bounty hunter's crew and something else. Like if those scenarios don't happen, both players are going to be playing chicken, going to turn infinite, and then eventually one of them is the cards are just not going to come up in their favor. It's not a matchup that will happen very much because I think a lot of people don't want to play control because of the timing rules, because of these mirrors and a number of other factors. But it does feel as though it's taking something out of the player's hands, and I'm open to being incorrect about this. It's just been my experience thus far. Like, I've won a ton of games that I feel as though I had no business winning just because my vigilance was better than theirs. It's the way it works. The other spice in the main deck here, which I have been talking with Anthony offline a little bit about, is the Crate Dragon. I'm not a huge fan of it. I think I'd rather have... Like, my version is running full sets of all the major units, Palpatine, Snoke, Avenger, so that you're hitting them every time. The problem is room has to be found somewhere. So either you're shaving some removal, you're shaving that tech to help out the mirror, or you have to accept that you're not running full complements of your actual finishers. Regardless, if you're going to run Crate, I feel like you'd be better off with another Avenger or Snoke. Now, as far as the board goes, Force Chokes, Bazine, Make an Opening, Avenger, and Crate. I like the idea personally of the Make an Openings. I think Bossk has a pretty good matchup into Jango already. Having played the Space Boba into Jango, or into Bossk rather, now there's Perilous on top of Make an Openings. Phantom is, you're not all in on Phantom, but it's pretty close, and this gives you more tools to fight it. Editing me once again, yes, it's cold. There's a Force Choke that was not on the SWDB image, but was in the deck. I don't know what happened, but there's an extra Force Choke in the board. Force Choke, of course, is going to help stabilize against Sabine. That is now absolutely way more winnable thanks to additions from set 3, such as Merciless Contest. Force Choke helps stabilize it even further. There's an argument maybe to have Force Choke's main, both for that matchup as well as against Han 1 yellow. Finding the room is tough, and of course, open fire can go cross arena, whereas Force Choke cannot. So, well, it can't hit vehicles. So technically, there are things in the ground arena it can't hit, but you get the point. The Bazines I'm not in love with for all the reasons I was outlining. Mainly, if you're not going to get the other game, like if you're not reasonably going to complete the other game, who cares? Like, is there even a point to boarding it? Maybe those sideboarding slots are better off being 3 more things to help you against Sabine, 3 more things to help you against Quinlan Tarkintown, 3 more things to help you against whatever, as compared to essentially wasting them on the control matchup. Maybe that's incorrect, but that's at least my initial thought on it. But either way, congratulations here to Anthony. Very well played. It came up briefly earlier, but Alternate Universes always chooses to take pictures of the decks on site, and it naturally makes it a little bit, there's a little bit more effort involved for me as I then transcribe everything to SWDB. I will say, however, there's always that one clown who just can't lay out their deck in a reasonable fashion so that it's easy to understand. Hi, it's me. I'm that clown. I'm actually almost embarrassed by the pictures, but you look at everybody else's and it's very well organized. It's all by cost, and mine is just well, here's 60 cards. I threw them on the table. But anyway, talking about the actual list, I played Han 1 yellow in this particular event. I've been playing it a lot recently. As of right now, my personal feeling for my upcoming PQ is one of 3 decks. It's either Jango Tarkintown, because I have a lot of experience with that deck. I really think the deck is amazing. Bossk ECL, because I really just want to play the deck, but it's personally, I think the Jango matchup is terrible. Or this list. Maybe not specifically this list, but this deck. And I've really enjoyed playing this after getting my head caved in by Ian back in PQ Season 0. I guess it's still technically 0. My first PQ. I had looked at the list way back when it was popularized at Gen Con at Baltimore and go, I don't get it. Why am I playing this? And I kind of just ignored it until I ended up getting my head caved in by Ian and just cooked. So now that it has been on my radar, I've absolutely been paying attention to it, and it does a lot of things that I've really enjoyed from other games. Namely, it does unfair things. The DJ combo, love it or hate it, or whether you want it banned or rotted, whatever, it exists today, and we got to play the game with how it exists. And being able to have a 2-resource swing, your opponent loses 1, you gain 1, is crippling. Additionally, discard, despite this being a draw 2 game, is incredibly effective and can clearly disrupt a ton of different archetypes. And we're not talking just, oh, I sparked your specific thing out of your hand that I wanted. It's also just the sheer quantity of, I ramp out Bodhi on 1, then I spark you on 2, or vice versa. Then I follow up with a Cunning to strip additional cards and reset your board position, or buff mine and push damage, on top of just screwing with the rest of everything you're doing via bounce. Advancing my board with Cantina Bouncer while resetting yours. Protecting my Han after I've demolished your hand, so that then I can safely ramp out the DJ to prevent you from even deploying your leader. And I have done a lot of videos discussing balance and NPE, or negative player experience, because I have designed a lot of games myself as a hobbyist. I've played a ton of games. I've been doing this since 1994. And I've rubbed elbows with a variety of game designers and world champions and things like that. And I find it fascinating when things like the Bozo combo exist. And I find it fascinating seeing what the reactions are from the first party of, do they feel this is okay? Do they feel this is broken? Is this outside the spirit of what they wanted? Is it not what they expected, but they like it? Well, it remains to be seen. We'll have to see. This deck allows you to do a lot of unfair things, whether that is the Bozo combo, it is the disruption, or it's ramping. Like, there are 3 different ways that this can attack you, and they require different answers, and you really have to think about it ahead of time. Now, I could do an entire video about this deck. There's definitely people who know it way better than me and deserve that attention significantly more than I do. Check out the masterclass, check out all of the VODs, all those things before you listen to me. I think the most difficult part of this deck is the floating triggers and remembering to properly manage them. As in, how many Han activations did you have? Did Zori Bliss attack? Did this happen? Did that happen? Okay, well, these things are going to happen this turn, meaning next turn I'm going to have XYZ, which sounds like, oh yeah, then the deck is difficult. But I think a lot of it comes down to properly communicating, not just with your opponent, but with yourself. So what I got into the habit of doing, in addition to using like reminder tokens, be like, hey, I have 2 Han activations. I have Zori Bliss trigger. I have whatever. It's also announcing to my opponent. I find personally that if I verbalize, I'm activating Han, I need to destroy a resource next turn, next action phase. I'm announcing the steps of my regroup phase. Like, I draw my cards, I resource a card, I ready my cards. Now I need to pay the Falcon tax. That sort of thing helps a lot with trying to both communicate with your opponent so they understand what's going on and that there isn't any kind of discrepancy along those lines. But also, when you verbalize it, I've found that it helps a lot to ensure that you're maintaining what needs to be maintained. Now, as far as the actual deck, I think for this coming weekend, because there's another Showdown and some locals, I'm probably going to try the Rebel version just to see. I'm being told that it's just strictly better. I'm not sure I'm in love with the Rebel version. Like, on paper, I don't like it. There are things about it that I really do like, but there are parts about it that really concern me. And that's where I think that I am floundering in my matchup knowledge, which I do put as a distinct category from the mechanics of the deck. And the reason for that is, whenever you pick up a deck, yeah, if you played the game enough, you'll have a clue how it does into certain things. But if you haven't played all the matchups, you don't know them that well. And there are certainly going to be scenarios where it's like, oh, how do I deal with this sort of hand, or when the game played out this way? That is different from ensuring that you can set up and understand the mechanics of how the deck operates as a whole. It probably sounds like splitting hairs, but I do feel like they are two different things to look at. As far as actual cards go, a lot of these are probably going to change numbers, but it's going to be mostly the same shell. You may be surprised by like the Emphas Nest or Han numbers or things like that, but it's mostly all the same. It's just like Enfys is better against some things, Han's better against others. The Zoris have been very good. I was trying out some stuff on the board that never actually hit play, like Chewbacca. Damo guards have actually been really good. I don't know. There's a bunch of things that I like, and it just comes down to, like the Jango list earlier, where there are text slots of I'm expecting this meta, or I just prefer this gameplay loop, and this is how I'm going to play the deck with this core 45 cards, and the other 5 are, seasoned to flavor. So that is our top 8 for this particular event. There's going to be more showdowns coming up in the area, and of course the PQs that are quickly coming down the pipeline. I'm very excited to see how the rest of this season plays out. I have some thoughts about the meta. I want to give myself the time to play in my first PQ before I really decide how I feel, because it's absolutely going to be a hot take, like nuclear hot take on the level of my Boba videos from last season. At least if I'm interpreting the general feeling about the meta as I've seen in different places. Let me know if you're interested in hearing about that. I've got some more testing to do for now. But that's going to do it for this time. Let me know your thoughts on these decks, the other events, the state of the Star Wars meta, what you'd like to see going forward. As always, everybody, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Random's Thoughts.